Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and today I am bringing you an HP EliteBook Revolve 810. Actually, I am bringing you two of these devices. So what we have here is actually the representation of both the Gen 1 and the Gen 2. Or is it the Gen 1 and the Gen 2? You see, looking at these from the exterior, there are practically no physical differences whatsoever between the Gen 1 and Gen 2. Internally, however, that is a completely different story. So just to give you a little bit of background on what exactly the Revolve 810 is an EliteBook class tablet computer that can twist and fold down. There is no stylus storage on this, so it was designed mainly to be used as a tablet, and of course you're touching the screen. You do have a dedicated Windows button up at the top to use it in tablet mode, and these also unsurprisingly came out in the Windows 8 era, or at least when it was certainly popular. They only spin one way and have a very similar hinge style to what we would see on the TouchSmart TM line, specifically the one that I owned, the TM2. One of the things that makes these stand out, of course, is that they belong in the EliteBook line, so they are incredibly durable, and you can tell that this one has seen a little bit of abuse throughout its life, but it is still kicking. In fact, these are both about to go on to another corporate life, and I happened to intercept them before they went there. So we'll start our exploration with the G1. Now, a lot of the specifications for these two overlap, and I will point out the key differences in each when we get there. The first thing I'll mention about the G1 and the G2 is they both have the same kind of screen. They have an 11.6-inch 1366 by 768 IPS display, and it's exactly what you would expect from a resolution of that ilk in a business class computer of this ilk that wants to be functional but not necessarily fantastic. It is also worth noting, if you need a nicer display, that they both have DisplayPort on the backhand side, and it is full-size DisplayPort, which is nice to see. And that DisplayPort can handle 2560 by 1600 at 60 Hz, or 19 by 20 by 1080 at 120 Hz. Those DisplayPorts are being driven on the G1 by an HD Graphics 4000, and on the G2 by a HD Graphics 4400. The G1 has Intel 3rd generation CPUs, i3, i5, and i7. The i3 is the 3227U, the i5 is the 3437U, and the i7 is the 3687U. On the G2, we have 4th generation Intel CPUs, and it is the i3, i5, and the i7 again. The i3 is the 410U, the i5 is the 4300U, and the i7 is the 4600U. Both of these machines will take DDR3 low power 1600 MHz RAM, and they both have 4 GB soldered onto the board. You can put in a 8 GB stick for a 12 GB maximum. One of the other key differences is actually in the hardware components themselves. The G1 uses a 256M SATA SSD as standard, whereas the G2 uses an M.2 SSD as standard, so keep that in mind as well. Wireless chipsets in the G1 were often the Centrino Advanced N6235, and in the G2 it was the wireless N7260. Other cards were available, as well as a few other accessories, but those are the general things that you will find these equipped with. Both have the same 6-cell 44 watt-hour battery. On the G1, most reviewers at the time were able to get about 5.5 hours, and on the G2, with the more power-sensitive CPUs, they were able to up that from anywhere from half an hour to a full hour of additional use. So depending on regional pricing, the G1 might not necessarily have all of the newer bells and whistles that the G2 has. However, if you can get the G1 at a better price, that is also a factor to consider. As I mentioned earlier, telling these two machines apart is essentially impossible by just looking at the physical exterior. There is no clue where the name is located, nor is there any difference whatsoever in the ports. It is also worth noting that all of the ports are essentially along the rear of the machine. That sounds like a good place to start, so let us start on the left-hand side and talk about any ports that we have. On the left-hand side, on the very bottom, we have absolutely nothing. We have the downward firing speaker, essentially. Along the front, we have nothing. On the right-hand side, if we flip it over, this is actually easier to see. We do have the HP proprietary docking port, a headphone microphone combo jack, and a micro SD card slot. Unfortunately, it is not a full-size card slot. Along the back, we have the Ethernet port, USB 3.0, a Kensington lock slot, display port, full size, another USB 3.0 port, as well as the charging port for the barrel plug. And that is essentially it for ports. As I mentioned, the G2 is no different in terms of its ports. It reuses practically all the same body panels and cases. So how do you tell these two apart? It's not the position of any stickers, unfortunately, and even then, that's not super helpful. And unfortunately, there is no regulatory labels either at first blush. What we actually have to do is take out the battery of each of these units to see what we're really dealing with. Removal of the battery is very, very simple. We move the catch over as far to the left as possible. There is an intermediary position like so, where you can just see the red. You keep pushing it and the battery will unlatch. Now, in the bottom right-hand corner right here, it will say HP EliteBook Revolve 810 if it's a Gen 1 model. If it is a Gen 2 model, like this one is, when we open it up, we will see a G2 suffix at the end of the name. So if you are buying this online and you want to confirm what you're actually getting, you will need to ask the seller to take a picture of that to ensure that you are getting indeed a Gen 1 or a Gen 2. If you're buying it in person, now you also know where to identify that, just to make sure that you can confirm the components inside if you're unable to turn it on. Of course, if you know what CPU is in it, you'll also know whether or not it's a Gen 1 or Gen 2. But without turning it on, that's the only way that I am aware of that you can actually tell these two apart. Without further ado, what we will actually go through is how to disassemble both the G1 and the G2. The process is identical. The only thing that will be different, of course, are the parts that we find inside. So to start our disassembly, we'll do the G1 first, and we will move the battery catch off to the side like we have before and eject the battery. We can see the two downward firing speakers, and then that is literally the only thing that we have access to. What we'll have to do is take our trusty screwdriver, and there are 8 screws that we need to remove this top panel. 4 of those screws are often covered here, 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 and here with little rubber nubbins. You'll need to remove those nubbins. On this one, they have already been removed because it's been serviced and serviced again. So those are easily removed and spun out. And then we have 4 screws along the bottom. 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. Manual said 4, I see 6. All right, it turns out it was just those 4 screws after all that need to come out. All right, there was a little clip on this right-hand side. With a little bit of coaxing, it's removed, no problem. All right, once we have this open, we can see that some upgrades have already occurred to this. We do have a SSD sitting here, the mSATA drive. The spot for the 3G card is currently vacant. We have our Intel wireless card, our 1 stick of RAM upgradable, and that is pretty much the only things that we have in here that we can service. The other thing that's worth pointing out is once this cover is removed, we can also remove the keyboard as well. The keyboard is held in with 2 screws. So the 2 screws that we need to remove for the keyboard, one is clearly labeled over here on this side of the machine with a pictogram. so we can spin that out of place. That's a pretty tough one to come out. The other screw is hidden underneath these antenna wires for the Wi-Fi card. All right, so this is the G2, which I took apart earlier, and you can notice primarily the key differences, and that is the layout of these components right here. We do have the SSD located in this configuration. We have our RAM in the same place, and then we have our Wi-Fi module up here. So this is the only real change to the machine, other than of course the chipset that's running it, but the chassis remains identical. I will also point out that the CMOS battery is tucked underneath this frame here. So if you're needing to replace that, removing this bracket here that acts as part of the roll cage of the machine, or the structural frame if you will, allows you access to that component. So let's put both of these back together and have ourselves a bit of a race. All right, with everything put back together, we're going to start both of these at the same time. On the left I have the G1, on the right I have the G2. So we'll just pull the power switch located on this side. And here we go, we're off to the races. And this one is the Core i7-3687U. So this is the top tier model of this generation. It is worth noting that this is the Core i5-4200U. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking for a 12-inch or subcompact, very well-built notebook that has some touch screen features that you can utilize, then this is actually a pretty easy one to recommend. The downside, of course, is that you do limit yourself to one drive, and it does have to be either the mSATA or M.2 SSD, so it is just worth keeping in mind. However, there is a lot to like. The build quality is good, the keyboard is good, there's certainly a lot of functionality to be had. And especially in these sorts of times where you need something that is reliable, probably inexpensive, but also still powerful, these 3rd and 4th gen Intel machines have an awful lot to offer even in the year 2020. At any rate, if you enjoy this sort of content and would like to see more, I'm going to encourage you to do the big 4. Please like the video, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, so the next time I feature a odd HP machine like this one, you'll be the first to know about it. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.